Alright, this is problem number 2 from homework 5, part 2. According to the Federal Trade Commission report on consumer fraud and identity theft, 23% of all complaints in 2007 were identity theft. This year, a certain state kept track of how many of its 1,260 complaints were for identity theft. They want to know if the data provided large enough evidence to show that this state had a higher proportion of identity theft than 23%. State the random variable, population parameter, and hypothesis. Our random variable is phi hat because we're talking about the proportion, but only of the smaller sample size, not every complaint, just for this 1,260 complaints for the one state. And it is the proportion of this right there, the percentage of 1,260 randomly selected complaints. P is a population parameter. It's basically the proportion of identity theft complaints for all of the Federal Trade Commission. So it's at 23%. So where is that? The percentage of all complaints filed with the FTC. Okay. Our null hypothesis is that the state and the FTC will have the same proportion of complaints. That's our null hypothesis. So we'll say that the proportion is going to be equal to, and we would type in 0.023 here. I can't type that in. And then the state wants to know if the data provide enough evidence that their proportion is bigger than that 23%. Okay, so anyway, I would type in 0.23 here, but I can't. So anyway, we would do a hypothesis test, and we want to figure out what a type 1 and type 2 error represent in the context of this problem. So let's say we do a hypothesis test, and the state actually has the same proportion as the Federal Trade Commission, but the hypothesis test tells us that it doesn't. And so we reject that they have the same proportion. That would be a type 1 error. So where the null hypothesis is true, but we rejected it. So let's see if we can find that one. So in this case, for this problem, sorry I had to go through and read them. There's so many options. A type 1 error would be rejecting that the percentage of all complaints filed with the FTC for that state that are for identity theft is 23% when the percent is really 23%. So basically the state thinks they have a different percentage of complaints. That's what they get from their hypothesis test, from their sample of 1,260. But maybe their sample is skewed, and so they reject that 23%. The type 2 error that we could have made is a failure to reject the false H0. So for the state, it might not be 23%, but our hypothesis might tell us that it is 23%. So the type 2 error would be a failure to reject this if it's not true. So in this case, that type 2 error would be failing to reject that the percentage of all complaints filed with the FTC for that state are for the identity is 23. So they think it's 23%, but in actuality it's higher than that, and there's just something wrong with their sample that has made that error happen. This is a confusing problem. So maybe I'll make another video with an easier problem to understand. All right.